The Human Rights and Palestine Solidarity Organization, BDS South Africa, has welcomed the calling off of the Africa-Israel Summit, which was meant to take place in Togo next month. The event was themed Building Bridges Towards Greater Shared Prosperity and was set to build Israel's diplomatic, trade and security relations with Africa. However, several countries, including South Africa, were planning to boycott the summit. Now, I'm joined in studio now by the National Coordinator of Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, Mohammed Desai. Very good morning to you, Mohammed. Thanks for being with us.
Morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Before I ask you to respond to the interview that you saw a little bit earlier, just give me a quick overview of why do you, as BDS, support the calling off of the Africa-Israel Summit?
Well, unlike the Jewish Board of Deputies, the Zionist Federation, or its lackeys, the BDS movement, both locally in South Africa as well as internationally, together with progressive organizations and movements on this continent, celebrate the calling off of the summit, because in many ways, our continent is not a continent of victims. Our continent is not a continent of charity. Our continent is a proud continent that has unshackled itself from the yoke of colonialism and is proudly charting a new way forward. And we don't need to be colonized by yet another occupying and repressive state such as Israel or any other oppressive regime. And so Israel really, its agenda within the African continent and with this Africa-Israel summit was really about its exporting of arms and military to our countries and to our people to cause further strife on the one hand, and on the other hand was literally even to bribe and to try to win votes within the United Nations by buying off African states. And so really this Africa-Israel summit was bad news for our continent, and we joined progressive organizations across the continent in welcoming the cancellation of the summit.
I asked our previous guest for a view on the concept of Israeli apartheid, and he went at length to say that there's no legislative framework that exists within Israel to deal with, or that shows that there is any form of apartheid in Israel. You at BDS have been very passionate about this. How do you view that?
Well, we can't participate in Mickey Mouse research. I think that we have to take our guidance from organizations such as Human Rights Watch, such as Amnesty International, and such as the United Nations that produced a report earlier this year in very clear language calling Israel's practices against the Palestinian people a form of apartheid under international law. But more significantly, perhaps for us as South Africans, is our stalwarts, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Professor John Dugard, and various others that have visited Palestine and Israel and have come back saying that the situation that us black South Africans experienced during the 70s, during the 80s, is a mirror image of what the Palestinians today are facing.
You then see the cancelling of the event in Togo. My previous guest also said Togo was the wrong venue for this for the summit. You see this as a win?
Well, it's an interesting one. It's interesting in that Israel chose Togo, this dictatorship in many ways, as the host for this Africa-Israel summit. Togo, after all, had the longest-serving African dictator on this continent, and thereafter, after he stepped down or after he passed away, his son took over for another 3 terms. This is a kind of partners that Israel looks in the world today. Doesn't look for democratic, peace and justice-loving people to forge relations, but instead looks for such authoritarian regimes. And so it's interesting that Israel would look at Togo to find such a partnership to further its interests on the continent.
A lot happened in the build-up to the summit. There were several threats in the lead-up to it. Just tell us about the decisions and the threats that led to the cancellation of the summit.
Well, we must put this whole thing in perspective firstly. Israel is increasingly under an immense isolation campaign. The United Nations produced a report just 2 years ago documenting how Israel has lost over 46% in foreign direct investment as a direct result of the international boycotts that the regime is facing. Israel is now looking into creating new partners and new partnerships, and is looking specifically at the African continent. The BDS movement, together with the Palestinian Authority, with Fatah, with Hamas, and the various other political organizations, together with Palestinian civil society and progressive Jewish comrades, both on the African continent, but in other countries as well, mobilized in terms of calling for a boycott. And various African countries began to say publicly that they will boycott, and some silently indicated that they won't be attending this Africa-Israel summit. But of course, there were a combination of reasons. There was, of course, the unrest in Togo and Benjamin Netanyahu's own corruption scandals currently in Israel that are taking the center stage.
Let's personalize quickly what's coming out of the West Bank and Gaza right now. What is the picture like? What does the picture look like for mothers and children and fathers every day?
Well, I think that the situation is probably the bleakest that we've ever seen it, both within the West Bank but also within the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, for example, the largest open-air prison in the world, as said by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, completely sealed off. The air borders, the land borders, the sea borders, completely sealed off from the international community. You have 1.7 million people living in the most densely populated piece of land on the earth. This is a piece of land of earth where Israel doesn't even allow things like chocolate or pasta to enter because of the embargo that it has in place on the people of Gaza for the last 10 years. So these are the kind of people that we are giving our solidarity to. These are the people that we are reaching out to, because these are also the people that during the darkest days of our own apartheid gave us the kind of solidarity and the kind of support that they are now asking for.
To wrap it up with the Africa-Israel summit, what's next within this space? Will you work towards making sure this never happens?
Well, I think that Israel is going to be trying really hard in the next few months to try to ensure that another similar summit takes place. But we've managed to create a good network on the African continent to now counter any Israeli influence in the continent. And also an interesting new ground that has been broken is the support and the constituency that has now been developed within churches on the African continent. Churches that are beginning to identify with the indigenous Palestinian Christians, for example, in Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and these churches that are now beginning to endorse the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. So at the African level, that is what we'll be working on, increasing our partnership with the churches on this continent. But locally in South Africa, as we go towards the ANC's elective conference, we're looking forward to the ruling party of this country adopting that resolution which calls for the downgrading of the South African embassy in Tel Aviv.
Mohammed, I thank you for joining us today. The National Coordinator of Boycott, Divestment and the Sanctions Movement here in South Africa and globally, Mohammed Desai.